Welcome back to Second Breakfast and our ongoing coverage of A Game of Thrones. We are going chapter by chapter through this delightful book. Have you guys heard of it? It's only been out for a little bit. Not very popular. Anyway, today we're talking about Bran number 5. I'm very excited to get into this. I was looking back through our episodes to figure out which Bran this one is. It's been over 2 months since we've seen this guy. Crazy how long we go in between characters.
I know, and I love that we're getting multiple chapters that are basically just Bran and Robb. I know there are 50 other supporting characters in this chapter,
right?
But I love strengthening the connection between these two guys.
Yeah, me too.
There's a real sadness and almost a spiritual feeling to the chapters that they have together, and I'm wondering if those qualities will survive once they splinter off from each other.
Right, because every time I think about Robb, I think about Robb and Catelyn together. Like, I think about A Clash of Kings and A Storm of Swords. Like, that's what I think about. I forget about Robb being at Winterfell for this whole book. So I'm treasuring this, and I'm curious to see how it changes once our group continues to split off and go into different combinations.
We've got omens, we've got wildlings, we've got scary letters and bad news and dire wolves and surprise attacks. There's a lot to jump into here.
Yes, there is. Let me give a recap of this chapter and then we can dive into our discussion. Quick spoiler reminder for everything past this chapter, books and show included. So this is A Game of Thrones, Bran number 5. Bran is riding out from Winterfell. I can't say that word. If y'all don't know, I have this thing with R's and L's, so I want to say Winterfell. I can't. Winterfell. He's riding out.
See, I thought you meant that you say writing and riding the same way.
Yes, because they're pronounced the same, because English is a broken language.
So what is he doing, and
he
from
is
where?
Riding on a horse out from Winterfell.
Beautiful.
For the first time since his fall. He's been practicing with his special saddle that Tyrion designed for him for the past couple weeks, and he's finally getting to leave Winterfell for the first time in a long time. And he is riding with Robb, Theon Greyjoy, Maester Luwin, and their security detail, basically. They also bring the direwolves with them, Summer and Grey Wind. Shaggy Dog and Rickon stay behind because Rickon's a baby and Shaggy Dog stays with Rickon. Anyway, they're riding out. And they ride through the village that's outside of Winterfell, and they eventually get closer and closer to the woods. And Bran decides that he wants to go a little bit faster. And so he and Robb go ahead of the group, and Bran is almost galloping. And this is really exciting for him. It feels really invigorating. Remember, he's been trapped in bed for weeks. So this is a great moment for him. Robb then tells Bran that a man arrived from King's Landing bringing a raven. And the man didn't arrive. The raven arrived. I misread my notes.
Wouldn't that be funny if
they just carry these birds? What the fuck is the point? I'm sorry, I misread. A raven.
His wings gets tired. I
gotta
have to
carry
help him. Yes.
What would be the point? Okay.
We take turns.
A raven arrives from King's Landing and bringing the news that Jory Cassell has been killed along with all of Ned's other men, and that Ned has been grievously injured. He broke his leg and he is unconscious, and they don't know when he's going to wake up.
The bird is unconscious?
The bird is unconscious. That's why he's being carried by the
man.
The
bird's named Ned.
Keep up, Cameron. It's a complicated plot.
What did you say? Grievously?
Grievously. I just guessed on that word. I don't remember how it's pronounced.
Grievously. Like General Grievous from Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith.
Cam, I haven't seen that movie.
He's the robot guy with all the arms and lightsabers.
I'm sure he is. Okay, so Ned has a broken leg. Okay. And Robb is trying to decide how to retaliate against this problem. Jaime Lannister killed his men and injured his dad. What do we do? And he's not Lord of Winterfell right now because Ned is still alive, but Ned had told him to be strong for Bran and Rickon, and Catelyn's not there, so Robb is sort of lost and doesn't know what to do. Bran starts to feel really nervous and says, "Hey, can we go home? I'm getting cold." And Robb says, "Well, we need to find the direwolves first," because they went off to go hunting. And so they move further into the woods to look for the direwolves. Robb and Bran sort of ride ahead, and they come upon a stream, and they can hear the wolves. So Robb says, "Okay, you stay here. I'm going to go find them really quick. You just hang tight. I'll be right back." Naturally, of course, Bran is alone. And suddenly 6 people just emerge from the woods. 6 shady, not so good, scary people emerge. And it's 4 men and 2 women. And Bran realizes that they're Night's Watch deserters. He catches that they're wearing black clothes. So he's like, oh no, these people are dangerous. And I'm wearing all this nice fancy clothes. I got my fancy brooch, and I'm paralyzed sitting on a horse. I'm totally screwed. Also, he's 8. And just as they're about to, important to note, and just as these guys are about to attack, Robb appears with the dire wolves. And so Robb initiates an attack and a big fight breaks out and he almost wins. But one of the guys is able to get a hold of Bran and hold a knife to Bran's throat. And he says, like, you know, hold off, like, don't do anything or I'm going to kill this kid. And he also says to kill the wolves. And Robb, like, doesn't know what to do. He's kind of short-circuiting. But before anything else happens, an arrow pierces the back of the man who's holding Bran. The arrow was shot by Theon and the guy dies. And so they have, of course, won this battle. Robb is furious because Theon took a major risk in shooting that arrow. He could have missed and hit Bran. He could have just injured the guy but not killed him. He could have like caused all kinds of problems. But Theon's like, okay, sorry, I saved your life, like whatever. But so that kind of creates an argument. One of the people did survive, one of the attackers. It's a woman named Asha, and it turns out she's a wildling. And so Maester Luwin advises that they keep her and question her, so they head back to Winterfell to do so. And that's where we leave.
I believe it's Osha.
Oh, is
from
it?
The show?
Okay.
I think it's Osha.
You know, it's Tonks from the show.
I can't, yeah, exactly. I can't get over this idea of a guy who carries his raven so that its wings don't get tired on deliveries.
I did not intend to plant that image into our brains,
like
but now it's there
courier.
forever.
He's got the little cage.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I like this idea.
I do too.
I would read that chapter in a second.
Okay, well, next week we'll cover the man carrying the raven.
So we've got a couple avenues we can go down with this chapter. I think there are basically two main options because there are two figures who hang over this chapter. And I think it's Ned and Dany. Who would you like to talk about first?
You're so right. Let's talk about Ned first, if that's okay with you. I, too, noticed that before, so just a little inside the episode for you listeners, before we start, Kim and I always, or lately, we've been doing like a quick, what kind of things are you talking about? We don't talk in detail, but we just get a broad sense. Turns out we're talking about kind of the same things, but in different ways, I'm sure. So I'm excited to do this.
Like last episode where we used the exact same paragraph for our entire argument.
That was unplanned, let me tell you.
We don't talk off mic. It's simpler that way.
Yeah, no, the podcast of life. This is it. This is the only one. No, let's talk about Ned. I noticed some parallels between our last Ned chapter and this one. I noticed a symbolic similarity. What kind of thing were you picking up on?
Symbols.
Oh, well, okay.
So I think it's basically a distillation of some of the symbols and hints and echoes and teases from last chapter's Targaryen checkpoint.
Oh, okay.
And I was reading all of those omens last chapter as representing Ned's impending demise. And I was struck by how those little hints and teases were distilled and made explicit in this following chapter, following this distillation echo idea we've been playing with since January, into an active discussion of Ned's death, his prospects, his succession, and then a revenge plot that would follow hypothetically after his death. And it reminded me of some of the Fire and Blood conversations we've been having over on Patreon, the source material for House of the Dragon, because we've talked so much, because that is an assembled history and not a real-time narrative, you notice patterns more cleanly. You're not distracted by things like dialogue and individual characterization.
Yeah.
So you're on this zoomed out scale, which is sort of the scale we get from Bran chapters anyway. But I loved getting this cycle of history of death and revenge and destruction. And it felt like it brought to life some of those eulogies of decay that we talked about in the last chapter. It's not just that the forest is described as sort of rotting and we're talking about dead people and then we start killing people.
Sure.
It's the plurality. It's the pattern. It's the cycle. And even just off the cuff, remembering some of the phrases we played with last week, dead cities, plundered gods, they're all plural.
True.
It is all about this cyclical violence.
Like it's not just a one-time thing. It continues. There's more than one.
Exactly. And this trend of distillation echoes is that an idea is made more explicit in the following chapter. And I thought George really kind of put a button on this whole idea. He crystallized all of these more ephemeral ideas with the phrase, let's hunt down the hunters.
I loved that phrase. I knew you were going to cling to that.
Well, I just think it kind of wraps everything up into a bow. And then you get some fresh hints. After we've kind of drawn a line under everything from last chapter, we start planting some new hints and landmines for future chapters. Right after that discussion about Ned, Bran notices a spider, which clues us into how Varys is sort of involved in Ned's decline and possible death, and the visits that we're going to have. We'll get there in the coming months.
Right.
But he's also then struck by a memory of the dead Jory.
Yes,
and he died in the last Ned chapter. And then discussion turns to the other sort of absent Stark bannermen. We have Benjen, Jon, and Jory come up in conversation. And that pulls me back to the last Ned chapter. Not just the discussion of him in the last chapter, which was a Dany chapter, but 2 chapters ago, which was a Ned chapter. The content of that chapter. Sorry for saying the word chapter so much.
Can you say it one more time?
Chapter. that episode where we talked about that Ned chapter was so much about Ned's head being stuck in the clouds and stuck in memory, because the previous chapter was all about Catelyn thinking about their living children, and Ned was very preoccupied with Robert's bastards and who Robert used to be and his dead sister and all of these absent friends and family. So instead of just talking about Ned like we did last chapter, we're throwing back to the last Ned chapter and recreating some of those head spaces, where here we have the dead Jory, the absent and possibly dead Benjen, the absent and possibly dead Jon Snow. And that reminded me of where Ned's head was the last time we saw him, where I hypothesized that he might be getting these little nudges from his gods.
Right.
And that's when I realized what was happening, sort of the Indiana Jones where you swap out the 2 things without anyone noticing. I think that's where the echoes crystallized for me in this chapter, because we're in a forest in the north tracking down some wolves. This is basically a god's wood and kind of a mind palace in the same way Ned would retreat into a mind palace.
Sure.
And the thing we know about Bran is that he has this heightened awareness. So in the same way Ned might have been nudged by the gods to, hey, stupid, get out of the street right now. We keep dumping rain on you to try to save your life. Jaime's about to kill all of your bannermen and friends. Get out of the rain. I feel like Bran was almost tapping into that same heightened awareness here. And it starts with his thoughts lingering on the lost in the dead in the same way Ned's did. We see that same track that he starts to go down, and then there's a harsh pivot. Do you have anything to talk about before the pivot?
Yeah, I do. Because I'm glad you mentioned the rain, because I think we've both seen an extension and an evolution of the rain metaphor in this chapter from the last Ned chapter. For you, the rain was like this sort of divine, not intervention, but hint and nudge.
Alarm bell. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And for me, I was reading the rain that was constantly falling in the chapter with Ned as corruption, as this like the corruption present in King's Landing, the corruption that's spreading throughout Westeros. And here I found that the rain continued, but in the form of snow. So I was trying to track that evolution. So we hear that throughout this chapter there is snow. It's not a blizzard. Winter is only just beginning, but we hear a lot about the snow. We learn that there is a light snow that melts on your face like the gentlest of rains. We see, it says, the joy Bran had felt at the ride was gone, melted away like the snowflakes on his face. We see that the woods are closing in around Bran when he's alone, and it says the snow was falling more heavily now. We also learn that the melting snow had soaked through his gloves to chill his hands. And finally, when Bran is watching the direwolves kind of stand there facing off the attackers, it says there was something gaunt and terrible about them as they stood there amidst the gently falling snow. So the snow is described as light and gentle, but it's also described as melting and getting heavier. And it's specifically described as melting into rain. The first time we see the snow, it says that it's a light snow that's falling and melting on your face like the gentlest of rains. And so for me, it feels like this snow, which is very comfortable and familiar to people in the North. It's not a new thing. It's not a scary thing. It's something they know how to deal with. You know, they have snowmobiles and, you know, they salt their streets. Unlike down here in Texas where no one knows how to deal with snow. They know how to deal with it, like literally, and it's familiar to them. But it's melting into this rain and into a thing that causes this discomfort, this cold, this like inability to function properly, and it's getting heavier and heavier. And so that to me feels like the corruption and evil present in King's Landing is seeping into Winterfell. It's like creeping its way in to other parts of the realm in a way that is not familiar or comfortable, and it starts to become dangerous as the chapter goes on, as the snow becomes more uncomfortable, as Bran becomes more aware of how cold he is. Things get more dangerous. He's attacked and almost killed by these guys who, fled from the north. So I think it's an interesting extension and continuation of that symbol that we saw with Ned.
At the risk of trying to explain something scientific, it does feel like part of that decay metaphor, just in the transition from a solid to a liquid to a gas.
Sure.
Because all of that snow, even if it is a blizzard, even if it is a block of ice so big that it's the wall keeping out the wildlings, eventually that can evaporate.
Right.
And just completely disappear.
Right.
So there is that kind of slow motion death happening here.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. I previewed at the very beginning sort of that observation about the Robb and Bran relationship. I called it sort of spiritual. And that's where I think this chapter sort of pivots from what we got with the last Ned chapter, because this feeling of possible ghosts, being so in touch with nature and the past and magical beings within direwolves, there is sort of a spiritualism to this chapter. But that doesn't linger on the center stage any more than it did in the last Ned chapter, where he's lost in memory and almost resurrecting these dead friends and family in his mind. And that is pivoted away when Jaime starts attacking and killing all of his friends and shattering Ned's leg. And here, Bran is beset by wildlings. So that tracks. That's a total structural parallel in these chapters, father and sons, clean cut. But it goes so differently because Bran is saved. I mean, you could say, I guess, if say things went another way and Ned ended up paralyzed from what happened to his leg,
right,
that would be an interesting parallel.
That would, yes.
But Bran is functionally saved from his surprise attack, and Ned isn't. And Bran has the advantages of family with Robb, friends with Theon and the rest of the people who work for them, and wolves.
Of course, yeah.
And Ned only has friends. So this is. I mean, I want to frame this as a question because I don't have a clean answer to it. What is the point of this diversion? Is the lesson that friends aren't enough and you need wolves and family too? What's the lesson in the difference? Is it as simple as the lone wolf dies and the pack survives? Or is it just we're rolling the dice and every time you're in a combat situation, shit happens, it's random, it's messy. How did you take this?
Yeah, it's tough because like Ned's guys are severely outnumbered, and that's a big reason why they all lose. But I think it comes down to lots of factors. It's the numbers, but it's also this whole thing about like familiarity. Like Ned's in an unfamiliar place without his family or his wolves. Here, Bran is up in the north, like not even a mile outside of Winterfell, in a forest he knows well, with his family and his friends and his dire wolves. And so he's got the odds are kind of stacked in his favor, even though he does start out outnumbered. At the beginning, it's just him and the guys, but then slowly, like Robb and the wolves show up, and then Theon and the other guys show up. So slowly, he's able to get more and more, advantage over the guys attacking him.
Yeah, maybe we should break it down into two halves, because at the beginning, when Bran is surprised, he doesn't have any of those assets. He doesn't have Robb, he doesn't have the direwolves, he doesn't have any of the Stark bannermen to help and defend him. He doesn't have Theon, the sniper, to help him survive that attack.
Right.
So he is outnumbered and surprised. And, I mean, he's not a skilled warrior, and he can't run away.
He can't do anything, yeah.
So I would say in that first second of the surprise attack, he and Ned are in pretty similar situations.
Yes, and interestingly, they both experienced leg injuries, because Ned's leg, of course, is broken, and Bran is like kind of cut by one of the guys. He like cuts through his one of the straps on his saddle and cuts his leg.
So by the end of it, I think you can say the lesson is strength in numbers, friends, family, wolves. These are all advantages, if we didn't know that already. But I wanna zoom in on that initial moment of surprise, because I'm really taken by this shit happens philosophy. I think that's much more the George R. R. Martin flavor of fantasy and realism and drama that we're dealing with. Because we've spent so much of the last few months, whether it's in these Game of Thrones discussions, in the House of the Dragon episodes with Tristan, or in the Fire and Blood episodes over on Patreon, we've really dialed into this idea of patterns and cycles of history. But there is this other factor, and I think that's the factor that animates the George R. R. Martin flavor of fantasy, and it's these monkey wrenches. It's the unexpected, the unexplained, the unprecedented, the unfair. It's the X factors that disrupt all of these clean patterns that we would like to observe and do literary analysis on. It's the echoes and parallels that are all fucked up by these X factors, by these monkey wrenches. It's those moments that totally shake the Etch-a-Sketch and you have to totally start over from scratch in all your theories. And that's basically what happens when you kill Ned Stark.
Right.
So I don't want to lose the forest for the trees here, because I think this ending serves as a reminder of those wilder elements. I think that's sort of the element of them being wildlings. I think it's a reminder that things do not go to plan, that this isn't a clean fall of dominoes of echoes from the last 3 chapters that pay off and teach us a lesson. It's not a storybook in that way. This is a much more volatile form of storytelling. In the same way, we've talked about this idea of narrativity before, where a character seems fated or destined. We've talked about plot armor, where everything revolves around them. But I don't think that's the point of this story. Namely, because we have so many POV characters, and when the wildlings and the guys who abandoned the wall, when they roll into this Bran chapter, they are not supporting characters in a Bran chapter. They're their own characters. With their own lives. You can tell from the way they interact. They feel fully rendered.
Lived in.
They don't feel like little guest stars or walk-on roles. They feel like full characters in the same way the guys who were marked by the White Walkers in the prologue felt like they had a full lives and goals and plans and accoutrement in their lives, you know?
Yes. Especially when you start your chapter with those guys, you think these are going to be some of our main characters. Like, why would you not be following any of these guys through the whole story? So you're sort of tricked into thinking they're your main characters because you start with them, but also because they feel so fully realized. Yeah, for sure.
So it's not like a fourth wall breaking thing of, oh, I need to interrupt these characters and kind of scatter everything to the wind and make it all messy again. I think the lesson of these types of stories is that narrativity overlaps. It's that you have 1,000 characters in this world and they all have their own sense of narrativity. But when those things overlap and contradict, that's when things get messy.
Sure.
I don't think it's about individual characters being fated. I think it's about the crisscross of all of these journeys.
Right. And I think what also works well at the end of this chapter, like to sort of distill any illusions we might have about, you know, Bran or Robb having plot armor, is that Robb is angry about Theon and what he did to save Bran. He didn't say, you came just in time. Oh, thank you so much. He says, you took a huge risk doing that. You could have hit Bran. The guy could have been wearing a breastplate and it could have bounced off of him. Like that could have gone really, really wrong. And like, it's very, very lucky that it worked, but that was like a really stupid thing to do.
Yes,
and he's like calling attention to how wrong things can go in this world.
If that happened in Lord of the Rings, which, I mean, you know, we love Lord of the Rings. We did many years talking about that series. But if that, I'm picturing that in the movies where Legolas snipes someone at the perfect time with an arrow.
Yeah, and Gimli's like, all right,
yes,
you know?
there would be a quip.
It would be funny,
because the plot armor and the fate and the destiny is it's differently calibrated in that world.
Right. Even though Bran is this incredibly fated, prophesied character.
Yes.
But like we are continually reminded of the random nature of things. I mean, even like the fact that Bran survives is like just because Robb showed up at exactly the right time. If he had been 30 seconds later, Bran would have died.
It's coincidence.
Yeah.
It's happenstance.
Which you could call fate, I suppose, but it doesn't quite feel like that. It feels a little, it's like, it's a combination between it kind of feels fated and like, oh, the guys just all happened to show up the second Bran's alone, but like maybe they were waiting in the trees like, for Robb to go off. I don't know.
And I think it's a really tough balance, but important for this series to maintain the blurriness around that question.
Yeah,
Are these random monkey wrenches or is there an invisible hand of fate,
right? Because you
intervening?
Because I think you need to have that a little. Because if you don't, then it just feels like, oh, this book series is like a random series of terrible events happening and nothing matters. Because if you go too far that direction, you don't have any hope. We don't worry and like wonder if Ned is going to survive, because if we just think that everything's random and terrible, we're like, oh, well, Ned's fucked now. Like everything's bad. Nothing's going to go right. So you have to have a little bit of this sense of like hope. And we've gotten so many seeds and, tendrils of prophecy and fate and omens and divinely ordained things that we have hope for our quote unquote fated characters. And so you need a little bit of that. Otherwise it's just like, what's the point? So I like that this chapter is really calling attention to that balance.
Yes, because even the fated characters don't feel like they're on rails. Mm-hmm. Like if they just let go of the wheel, everything's going to work out for them. It is still a struggle. They have a sense of purpose and direction,
yes,
but they struggle the whole way there. And I think that's a perfect transition into talking about Dany.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
That's what I had first in my notes here, because I think I drew that comparison more easily between Dany and Bran, because I put them next to each other on the shelf in the way I think about characters from this story. They are the two most prophesied characters. They are the characters where I cede the floor to you, and we get to talk about visions and dreams and destiny. But even in the very beginning, Bran is kind of touring a dead city in the same way Dany was. And they talk about when it gets into really harsh winter, these people relocate, and so things like become a dead city. So again, you're distilling and making literal some of the ideas from the previous chapter. But we anchor that in a phrase. Again, we sort of explode. The end result of a distillation echo is that it explodes the idea. It completes the idea. And here we give it a name, and we have new context for the label winter is coming. But here's where I got some sort of inverted echoes. And again, I want to play with the way we're reminded of a character and then the paths diverge very pointedly. So we're diverging almost immediately from Dany, because Bran has Robb and Dany has Viserys.
Yeah.
It's such
two very different older brothers. Yeah.
Yes, it's such a stinging inversion of the older brother dynamic we saw in the last chapter, where Robb is so calming and loving. He's protective. He's a confidant. The way he tells Bran these hard truths that he's learned from all these letters. He wants to protect him, but he also trusts him enough to give him this information and not keep it from him.
Right. Like he admits he doesn't know quite how much to tell him, but in this moment he decides to reveal more information than it seems like he has so far. He's trusting him more.
Warmth, concern, courtesy versus
love.
Everything from Viserys in the last chapter. There are 3 of these inversions I wanted to touch on. The second one is we get the protection of living direwolves, sensing omens, howling, alerting their masters, versus Dany just desperately clutching to a dead dragon egg.
Yeah. Wow.
I mean, it's painful. These echoes, they all serve as testaments to Dany's disadvantage at every turn, which I think makes her continued survival all the more impressive.
Yeah, really.
But the bottom line of these echoes is that she and Bran are both tested. We keep talking about problem of evil poison characters. I would say Dany and Bran have as much argument to be as bitter and cynical as anyone else in this world so far.
Yes.
And they're not. They are both still survivors, and they have almost a spiritual idealism to them. The third inversion there was the letters. I was really struck by how the whole chapter slowed down, and Bran is updated on all of these recent developments from Robb. They get these news, they send out their own birds and give some orders. Compare that to Dany, who's alone in the Khalasar. Most of the people don't speak her language. She has no contacts. She has no seat of power. Instead, we see councils in King's Landing that are considering whether or not they should murder her.
Sure, and like her only like method of communication to the outside world is Jorah, who at this moment is like a traitor and is like working against her secretly.
Exactly.
So she's got nothing.
Instead of a Maester Luwin, she has a traitor. It's the difference between the informed and the informants. So those 3 inversions between Dany and Bran, the fact that they are still almost on equal footing, that they're both surviving and making do, it's a testament to Dany, but it also continues to draw comparisons between these characters to the point
Yes.
that I'm following their storylines on these parallel tracks and looking for these echoes. It's an interesting moment of posture here.
Yeah. I mean, and one of the things I noticed a big similarity between these two, reflecting on something you had brought up last week about Dany. You talked about this almost like childlike hope that she clings to, this sort of like idealism that she has of her, like thinking of herself as this fated, destined person, like destined for great things, even in spite of like terrible tragedy. And she's not naive about it, but it like reminds us of her childlike state, I think. And that I think comes through with Bran here too. We see Bran sort of flitting between hope and fear constantly throughout this chapter, but the hope keeps coming back, even though shit keeps getting worse and worse in this chapter. We see that when they're riding through the woods for the first time, like when he's going fast for the first time, it says his anxiety faded and a tremulous smile crept across his face. It's not like a big, broad, like, oh, everything's dandy now, but a tremulous smile, okay? We also learn that when he hears that, when Robb tells him that another raven has come, Bran thinks to himself, Bran clung to hope. And that's after we get the whole paragraph about all the other ravens that have brought bad news. So Bran is still clinging to hope. And then when he's in the woods later, it says he felt strong again and whole. He looked up at the trees and dreamed of climbing them. He knows he can't climb them. He doesn't have hope that he will, but he dreams of it, right? Like, even though he's not literally dreaming here, just like that, using the word dream when you're awake is like this, it's almost a wish, right? And then when Robb comes back to help Bran after the guys show up, he brings the wolves, like Robb to the rescue. It says Bran looked up in desperate hope. And so Bran has this, like, he retains this childlike hopefulness and determination, even in spite of repeated tragedy. Again, it's cautious. It's not naive. And we even see Bran, like, wanting to look brave and, like, not wanting to go home, even though, like, he wants to go home, but he wants to stay on his horse because Robb is on his horse too, and he wants to look brave like a knight. And so he's got this determination and hopefulness to him. But we talked about how, like, I think these two have different flavors of this, because Dany has like this hope and idealism, but it's mixed with her Targaryen fieriness and that like danger. But with Bran, it's mixed with the Stark like realism and grittiness and determination.
Sure.
Yes, exactly. His iciness. Oh. Ugh. But so it makes for interesting combinations again between these two fated, childlike or like literally children characters who are experiencing terrible tragedy and again should be the most like jaded, hopeless characters. And like I said earlier, they have this little element of hope and belief in prophecy and fate that gives them like this sense of purpose and makes us believe in them and makes us hope for them and root for them and not just like resign ourselves to the terrible tragedies of the world and be like, well, everything sucks and oh yeah, this kid's gonna be sad and die and this girl's gonna be sad and die. Like we have a hope because they do too, you know?
It's such an interesting parallel because they end up at the same places through such different journeys.
Yeah.
I mean, even while you were talking, you sort of connected some dots for me from last week. We were talking about Dany's sort of corrupted, broken concept of home. She considers King's Landing to be home, a place she's never really been, in living memory at least. She was there as an infant.
No, she wasn't. She was born like on Dragonstone. She's never been to King's Landing. Yeah.
But in the same way, if Bran is mostly bound to his bed in Winterfell, and the thing we know about him from the first second of the first chapter is that his whole thing was climbing around Winterfell.
Right.
He can't do that anymore. Most of his family's gone. He still has his home, but he doesn't have the things, that turned the house into a home. He's slowly detaching from that concept of home as well.
Yes,
but maybe it's even more or equally upsetting because he's still in the physical location. So they're both going through these just brutal, I mean, it's almost this Arrested Development thing.
Sure.
Where they're trying to, with a little more incest, they're trying to grow up. They're trying to grow up, but they're also trying to hold on to some of that optimism and youth and love, and you can see how comforted he is by Robb's presence. He goes from wanting to be able to stand on his own and ride the horse at his own speed to wanting to be within that shelter of his older brother. And I think that was what Dany was doing in the last chapter, where she tried to make amends with Viserys and get him all these gifts. And here, my handmaid went and got you some goat because
meat.
I know you don't like horse meat.
Yeah.
Those identities kind of pulling in opposite directions are just these beautiful unfolding tragedies. I love the parallels here.
Me too. And if you want to zoom out for a second, like, I wonder if the difference between the relative success and failure of both of these characters is that Bran has this, we learn what he wants and what he dreams of from the beginning, but he knows he can't have it in that way. And so he has it in a different way by becoming this three-eyed raven who can climb above everything and see everything, but in like this much more metaphorical, magical way, and not in like a literal way of climbing on the, the ramparts of Winterfell and becoming a knight. Whereas Dany, her dream is to, take the Iron Throne, and she never changes in that. Like, she never wavers in that desire. She never like accepts, well, maybe I can have power in a different way. Maybe I can unite the kingdoms in a different way. Maybe I can be a leader in a different way. And instead she just kind of stubbornly wants to be queen, and then it doesn't work out. I mean, that's a really simplified way to look at it. But
no, but I think that's valid. I mean, one of them goes with 3 eyes. One of them goes 3 dragons. And they both end up on the same fucking throne.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
To different levels of success, but still, it means this idea of them ending up at the same place through such different means.
Different paths, yeah.
We've seen that works all the way through the end of the series.
Yeah. Interesting to track the parallels between these two. And again, I like that both of them tend to be framing these segments of the book. I don't know if it's always going to be Dany Bran, like it might change up as we go. I mean, it didn't even start like that, but although I think the first 2 chapters are Bran and Dany, so no, I think it's Bran, Catelyn, then Dany. Anyway, whatever. It's interesting the way that they frame the whole rest of the story. It's fun to watch.
Yes, I'm very excited to see what happens going forward. I've seen in interviews, I've heard George R. R. Martin talking about writing the chapters in different orders. He doesn't always write it in the order that it ends up in the finished book. He'll say,
sure.
If it's cracking on Tyrion, I'll just do 3 or 4 Tyrion chapters and then assemble them or move them around. Or as we saw with A Feast of Crows and the last one, why am I blanking?
Dance of Dragons.
I keep thinking Dying of the Dragons because of the fire and blood
Dance
thing.
of the Dragons, which is not the same.
That one was ending up too long, so they just split it.
Right.
And ripped out half of the characters and split those into 2 books and then built that out. There seems to be such beauty and resonance and intentionality in the organization of these chapters that it's even more impressive that he might not have written them this way.
Sure, yeah, but in bringing them back together, it's like, oh yeah, this works really well. Anyway, it's fun.
Yes.
Well, next week we'll be with Tyrion, which will be very exciting.
So
back to the Eyrie, but from a different perspective. So looking forward to that. Let us know what you thought of this chapter. What do you think of the stuff we talked about? Any other ideas that you had from reading this? If you're on YouTube, you can leave a comment below. Otherwise, if you're listening via podcast, you can email us, secondbreakfastpod@gmail.com, or find us on Instagram at secondbreakfastpod. And of course, we do have a Patreon. If you're interested in that, we do bonus episodes over there. As Cam hinted at, we have done an entire series on the Fire and Blood book, which is the source material for the House of the Dragon show. We kind of did it similar to this, a chapter by chapter read through of that book. We started in the middle of the book.
They're big ass episodes.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah, we started in the middle of the book where the House of the Dragon show starts, and then we finished it. And right now we're working on putting out our final episode, which will be the whole first half of that book.
Should be out this month.
Anyway, it'll be out this month. A little confusing, but it's there for you on top of a bunch of other bonus episodes about other stuff. Horror, Spider-Man, like all kinds of things. So check us out over there. Link is in the description of whatever it is you're listening to. And I think that's everything.
Yes, thank you very much for joining us. Yeah. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in just a few days with a brand new episode.
Bye.